In the arid wilderness of Paran, where the sun beats down with relentless fury and life clings precariously to the parched earth, a storm of a different kind was brewing. It was the shearing season, a time meant for celebration and abundance. Yet the air was thick not with joy, but with the suffocating tension of impending violence. The sounds of bleating sheep and the boisterous laughter of shepherds were but a fragile veil over a deadly insult that had been hurled like a stone. Nabal, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance, had spurned the humble request of David, the anointed-but-not-yet-crowned king of Israel. His words, dripping with contempt, echoed through the canyons. "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" This was not merely a refusal of provisions. It was a profound act of dishonor, a spark thrown into the tinderbox of a warrior's pride, igniting a firestorm of vengeance that was now marching silently and swiftly across the desert landscape. Amidst this world of brute force and foolish pride lived Abigail, a woman whose name meant "my father's joy." Her existence was a study in contrasts, an oasis of wisdom in a desolate wasteland of folly. The sacred text describes her as a woman of profound understanding and beautiful form, a beacon of grace bound by marriage to a man defined by his own name, Nabal, the fool. While her husband reveled in his material possessions, his heart hardened by avarice and his mind clouded by wine, Abigail possessed a discerning spirit. She could perceive the subtle, dangerous currents of human interaction and the grand, overarching hand of divine providence. She understood that Nabal's insolence was not a trivial matter, but a catastrophic miscalculation, an act that had set their household on a collision course with a destiny forged in righteous anger and holy purpose. The chasm between Abigail and her husband was not merely one of temperament, but of spiritual perception. Nabal, in his drunken stupor and self-importance, saw only a band of vagabonds led by a fugitive. He was blind to the anointing on David, oblivious to the fact that he was mocking the man God had chosen to shepherd his people. His world was small, confined by the fences of his pastures and the walls of his own ego. Abigail, however, saw with stunning clarity. She recognized in David not a renegade, but the future of Israel. She knew that his cause was intertwined with God's divine will, and that the fury now directed at her home was the righteous anger of a man whose honor, and by extension God's honor, had been grievously wounded. Her wisdom was a quiet, powerful force in a house deafened by the noise of folly. The consequences of Nabal's foolishness were now measured in the steady, rhythmic march of 400 armed men, their swords sharpened and their hearts set on annihilation. A decree of death had been issued from the lips of a wounded and enraged David, a vow to erase every male from Nabal's household. Before the morning light, the fate of many rested upon the ignorance of one, and the only hope for salvation lay in the wisdom of a woman who was not even consulted. Her story is a powerful testament to the fact that true strength is not found in the sword, but in the discerning heart. Before we delve into the courageous actions that would change history, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and become part of our community. Let us know in the comments from which city you are watching as we explore this profound lesson in divine intervention. The call to action did not come as a thunderous voice from the heavens, but as a hushed, desperate whisper from a young servant, his face etched with the terror of what he had witnessed. He found Abigail not in the midst of the raucous feast her husband was holding, a feast like the feast of a king, but in a space of quiet contemplation, her spirit already unsettled. The servant's words painted a grim picture, recounting Nabal's churlish dismissal of David's men, who had been a wall of protection for them in the fields. He spoke of the looming danger, a disaster, determined against our master and all his household. This report was Abigail's divine summons. It was a moment of profound clarity, where the chaos of the present revealed a singular, terrifying path. She understood instantly that inaction was complicity, and that God had placed the fate of her entire household not in the hands of its foolish master, but into hers. The opposition she faced was a formidable, two-headed beast. On one side stood her own husband, Nabal, a man whose name was synonymous with his character, a fool whose pride had become a death sentence for everyone under his roof. To act was to defy his authority, a perilous move for any woman of her time. On the other side marched David, the anointed of God, a celebrated warrior now transformed into an instrument of vengeance. He was not a villain, but a righteous man consumed by a vengeful fire, his judgment clouded by personal insult. Abigail's mission was to stand in the gap between these two destructive forces of foolishness and fury. The tension was palpable. Her wisdom was a direct confrontation to her husband's authority and a plea for restraint against a warrior's sworn oath. She was armed not with a sword, but with insight and courage, stepping into a conflict where her very life was the price of failure. With a speed born of desperation and divine clarity, Abigail did not waste a single moment in lament or debate. While her husband Nabal was lost in a drunken revelry, feasting like a king in blissful ignorance of the death sentence he had pronounced upon his own house, she orchestrated a counter-move of profound wisdom. She hastily gathered a generous offering, 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, and measures of grain, raisins, and figs. This was not a mere bribe intended to buy safety. It was a carefully calculated act of diplomacy, a tangible apology that spoke louder than words. It was a gesture of honor meant to soothe the wounded pride of a warrior and demonstrate the respect her husband had so foolishly withheld. Each element of the gift was a silent testament to her foresight, a provision for peace, dispatched to intercept an army bent on war. She loaded the provisions onto donkeys, sending her servants ahead as an advance guard of humility, and followed behind, a solitary figure moving against the tide of impending violence. The scene is one of staggering visual and conceptual contrast. An army of 400 men, their swords glinting under the harsh desert sun, marching with a unified purpose of destruction, and a single woman, armed only with provisions and a righteous cause, riding to meet them. When she saw David, she dismounted in haste, prostrating herself before him, her face to the ground. This was her first and most powerful strategic maneuver, an act of complete submission that immediately began to dismantle the architecture of his rage. She did not stand to defend or argue. She knelt to appeal, creating a space for reason to penetrate the armor of his fury. Her words began not with an excuse, but with a startling assumption of guilt. "Upon me, my lord, upon me let this iniquity be," she pleaded, her voice cutting through the tense silence. In this masterful stroke of empathy, she validated David's anger while simultaneously redirecting its focus. She drew the poison of his wrath into herself, shielding her household by becoming the lightning rod for the storm. By taking responsibility for a sin she did not commit, she disarmed him completely. He had come prepared for a confrontation, for a battle against an arrogant house, but he was met instead with a humble woman who willingly placed herself under his judgment. This act of sacrificial substitution immediately shifted the dynamics of the encounter, forcing him to see not an enemy, but a supplicant. She then addressed the source of the conflict with piercing honesty, urging David, "Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." She did not defend her husband's character. She exposed it as the root of the crisis. By doing so, she reframed the entire situation. Nabal was not a worthy adversary whose insult demanded the bloody retribution of a future king. He was an insignificant fool, a non-entity whose actions were beneath the concern of a man destined for greatness. She was appealing to David's sense of honor and stature, subtly arguing that to annihilate the household of such a man would be to diminish himself, to stain his noble destiny with the blood of the foolish and the innocent alike. The core of her appeal then transitioned from diplomacy to divine counsel, becoming a powerful warning that echoed with prophetic weight. She presented herself as an agent of God's intervention, declaring that it was the Lord himself who had restrained David from the sin of bloodshed and the error of avenging himself with his own hands. She was reminding him that his life, his battles, and his future were all in the hands of God, not in the strength of his own sword. To proceed with this massacre would be to reject God's providence and to carve a deep wound into his own conscience, a staggering of heart that would haunt him when the Lord fulfilled his promises. She was fighting not just for the lives of her people, but for the purity of David's future reign. Her plea was a masterclass in appealing to a person's higher calling, implicitly foreshadowing the very words of relief and blessing David would soon utter. She was essentially laying the groundwork for him to recognize the divine deliverance in her intervention. The phrase he would later speak, "Blessed be the Lord, who has kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand," was the very essence of her argument. She was teaching him in that moment that true strength lies in restraint and that true justice belongs to God alone. By seeking his own vengeance, he was stepping outside of God's will and taking a path that led to regret. She offered him a different path, one of forbearance that would secure his legacy as a just and merciful king. As she spoke, the rigid fury in David's posture began to soften. The storm in his eyes, which had mirrored the unforgiving desert, began to recede, giving way to a flicker of astonished recognition. Her words were indeed like cool water, dousing the flames of his rage and washing the dust of vengeance from his eyes. He had been marching with the singular blinding focus of a predator, his ears deaf to anything but the beat of his own vengeful heart. The men following him were a reflection of his own hardened resolve, ready to execute his command without question. But Abigail's wisdom, her courage, and her profound spiritual insight created an unexpected pause, a moment of piercing clarity in the midst of his murderous momentum. She had successfully transformed a mission of revenge into a moment of divine reckoning. Her great alert was not a shout, but a carefully articulated appeal to reason, faith, and destiny. She held up a mirror to David, forcing him to see the man he was about to become, a man stained by innocent blood, in stark contrast to the king God had anointed him to be. The provisions she brought were a peace offering, but her words were the true gift, an offering of wisdom that had the power to save him from himself. The decision now rested with him, the silence hanging heavy in the desert air as the weight of her words settled upon his conscience, poised to change the course of his life forever. This was the pivotal moment, the point of no return, where the entire narrative hinged. As Abigail's words, imbued with divine reason, settled in the air, a profound and visible transformation occurred in David. The storm of fury that had clouded his vision and hardened his heart began to break. It was as if a fever had passed, leaving behind a startling and sober clarity. The hand that had rested so readily on the hilt of his sword, a symbol of his imminent and bloody justice, now fell limp to his side. He looked down at the prostrate woman before him, and for the first time, he did not see the wife of his enemy or an obstacle to his vengeance. Instead, he saw a messenger, a vessel of an authority far greater than his own, an instrument sent by God himself to pull him back from a precipice of sin and regret. The silence was finally broken, not by a command to attack, but by a voice filled with awe. and profound relief. David's words became the climax of this divine intervention, an eruption of praise that affirmed the miracle that had just transpired. He blessed the Lord God of Israel first, explicitly acknowledging the divine hand behind this encounter. Then he blessed Abigail's wisdom, recognizing her counsel not as mere human ingenuity, but as a channel of heavenly guidance. Finally, he blessed her personally, crediting her with physically preventing him from committing a terrible act of blood guilt. He had marched out that day as an avenger, a man determined to carve out his own justice, but he would now return as a man who had been humbled and saved, not by a show of force, but by the power of a wise and courageous word. Throughout this tense exchange, Abigail remained a portrait of courageous intercession. The weight of her mission was immense, a burden that would have crushed a lesser spirit. Every word she spoke was a calculated risk, a delicate step on the treacherous ground between a fool's pride and a king's wrath. While she presented an external image of calm and respectful supplication, one can only imagine the tempest within her own heart, the fear of failure, the adrenaline of her desperate plea. She was not merely a passive messenger repeating a divine script. She was an active participant, a spiritual warrior who had placed herself squarely in the path of a destructive force. Her humility was her armor, and her wisdom was her sword, wielded not to wound, but to heal the very man who held the power of life and death over her. This encounter serves as a powerful testament to the nature of divine action. God's intervention is not always a cataclysmic event, a parting of seas or a pillar of fire. Often it is far more intimate, manifesting in the courage of a single individual, the wisdom of a timely word, or the sudden dawning of clarity in a troubled soul. In this narrative, God did not strike down David's enemies or send an angel to block his path. Instead, he sent Abigail. He acted through her discernment, her quick thinking, and her willingness to step into a dangerous void. She became the living embodiment of God's restraining grace, proving that the most profound miracles are often those that unfold within the landscape of the human heart, orchestrated through the faithful actions of his obedient servants. With the crisis averted, the resolution was swift and decisive. David formally accepted the provisions she had brought, a symbolic gesture of peace and reconciliation. "Go up in peace to your house," he commanded, his voice now gentle, stripped of its earlier, hardened edge. "See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person." With those words, the decree of death was officially revoked. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the ranks of the 400 warriors who stood witness to this extraordinary event. They had followed their leader into the desert, ready to unleash a torrent of violence, but now they would follow him back in peace. The point of no return had been crossed, not into a valley of bloodshed, but onto a higher ground of mercy and divine wisdom, all because one woman dared to intervene. While grace and mercy were rewriting David's destiny in the wilderness, an altogether different fate was being sealed within the walls of Nabal's estate. The inevitable judgment, though delayed by Abigail's intervention for the household, was closing in on its primary target. When Abigail returned, she found her husband oblivious, his senses dulled by wine, and his mind lost in the fog of self-indulgent celebration. The scripture notes he was very drunk, a state that perfectly mirrored his spiritual condition, intoxicated by his own pride and completely unaware of the mortal danger he had invited. Wisely, she waited until the morning, until the wine had left him but his folly remained. When she recounted the events, the approaching army, David's murderous vow, and her desperate intercession, the full weight of his foolishness finally struck him. The consequence was not a sword from an external enemy, but a collapse from within. His heart died within him. and he became like a stone. This swift and severe outcome serves as a stark illustration of the law of cause and effect, a principle woven deeply into the fabric of biblical justice. Nabal's downfall was not a random tragedy, but the direct harvest of the seeds of his own arrogance and contempt. His refusal to honor David was more than a social slight. It was a rejection of the divine order, a blatant disregard for the man God was raising up. The Lord's justice in this instance was precise and personal. David was spared the sin of vengeance because that responsibility belonged to God alone. Approximately 10 days after Nabal's stroke-like affliction, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. The judgment was not just inevitable, it was divinely executed, demonstrating with chilling finality that God is the ultimate arbiter of justice, who will not allow foolish pride that mocks his anointed to go unpunished. The connection between Nabal's sin and his fate is inseparable. His callous heart, which had refused to show generosity and respect, literally turned to stone within his own chest. His story stands as a solemn warning that a life built on selfishness and insulated by wealth is a fragile structure liable to shatter at the first tremor of divine reckoning. The prosperity that he believed made him untouchable became utterly meaningless in the face of his mortality. He was a man who had everything and nothing, rich in possessions but bankrupt in wisdom and spirit. The judgment that befell him was not merely a punishment, but a powerful revelation of his true inner state, a physical manifestation of the spiritual death he had long been cultivating through his malignant and foolish ways. Out of the somber ashes of judgment, a surprising light begins to dawn, shifting the narrative from the finality of death to the dawn of restoration. When the news of Nabal's divinely ordained end reached David, his response was not one of triumphant gloating, but of profound and reverent worship. He immediately blessed the Lord, recognizing that God had not only vindicated his honor, but had done so in a way that kept his own hands clean from the stain of vengeful blood. This moment is the story's true glimmer of hope, a powerful demonstration that waiting upon the Lord's justice yields a far greater victory than any that can be won by the sword. The darkness that had enveloped Nabal's foolishness was now fully dispelled, revealing the unwavering faithfulness of a God who judges and restores in perfect measure, turning a potential tragedy into a testament of his sovereign righteousness and protective care over his chosen ones. The promise of restoration in this narrative is beautifully twofold, first manifesting in the preservation of David's own soul and destiny. By heeding Abigail's wise counsel, David was saved from a catastrophic moral failure, an act of mass violence that would have cast a long, dark shadow over his future reign. He was spared the staggering of heart that Abigail had prophesied, the gnawing guilt and public scandal of a king who took justice into his own hands. God's intervention through Abigail was a course correction of eternal significance, safeguarding not just his reputation, but his very character. This was the restoration of his path, a powerful reminder that his throne would be established not on the unstable ground of personal vengeance, but on the bedrock of divine justice and mercy, ensuring his legacy would be one of integrity. The second and perhaps most poignant thread of restoration is woven into the destiny of Abigail herself. Freed by God's hand from a life of silent suffering, chained to a man whose spirit was as coarse as his name, she is now elevated to a position of honor she could never have imagined. Upon hearing of Nabal's death, David immediately recognized the true treasure he had found in the wilderness, the wisdom, grace, and courage of Abigail. He sent his servants to bring her to him, not as a spoil of a conflict, but as a cherished partner, asking her to be his wife. This was her divine reward, a testament to a God who sees the plight of the faithful and elevates the humble. Her story is transformed from a cautionary tale of a wise woman in a fool's house to an inspiring saga of a queen rising from the dust. In this new context of redemption and reward, David's grateful exclamation takes on its fullest meaning, resonating now not just with relief, but with the profound joy of hope fulfilled. The phrase, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be your advice, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand," is no longer merely a confession of a sin avoided. It has become an anthem of divine providence. It is a celebration of a God who does not just prevent our fall, but who also paves a new path forward, a path of blessing and honor. The words, once spoken in the shadow of an imminent massacre, now shine brightly, illuminating a future where divine wisdom triumphs over. Human folly and faith is rewarded with a restored and elevated destiny. The legacy of Abigail echoes down through the centuries, a timeless testament to the immense power of wise and courageous intervention. She is remembered not as a victim of her circumstances, but as a proactive agent of peace who reshaped her own destiny and altered the course of history. Her story is a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that strength is found only in physical might or political authority. Instead, her life champions a different kind of power, the profound strength inherent in discernment, humility, and the courage to speak truth, even when facing a storm of anger. The grand idea enshrined in her narrative is that a single individual, aligned with God's wisdom, can become the fulcrum upon which destinies turn, demonstrating that true influence lies not in demanding respect, but in earning it through righteous action and a heart attuned to the will of God, preserving the future by safeguarding the present. The great spiritual lesson from Abigail's life is that genuine wisdom is never passive. It is an active, intervening force for good. It does not stand idly by while foolishness and pride set a course for destruction. Instead, it rises with courage, acts with urgency, and speaks with a clarity that can disarm rage and restore reason. Her story teaches us that we are called to be instruments of peace and reconciliation in our own spheres of influence. We learn that one person's discernment can protect leaders from their own destructive impulses and remind them of their higher purpose. It challenges us to consider our role in the conflicts around us. Are we contributing to the escalation with our silence? Or are we, like Abigail, willing to humbly step into the gap, offering a word of wisdom that can diffuse a volatile situation and guide others back to a path of righteousness? This ancient story poses a piercing question to our modern lives. Who is the Nabal and who is the David in our world today? Where do we see the collision of arrogant folly with inflamed, vengeful pride? It may be in our homes, our workplaces, or even in the broader social discourse. What is the impending bloodshed, the relational, emotional, or spiritual destruction that our timely intervention could prevent? Are we willing to be an Abigail? Are we prepared to act with foresight and humility, offering a provision of peace and a counsel of restraint, even at great personal risk? Her legacy compels us to look beyond the immediate insult or conflict and consider the long-term consequences, urging us to be the voice that reminds others and ourselves of the better way, the path of divine justice over personal vengeance. Ultimately, the story of Abigail is a breathtaking portrait of the sovereignty of a God who masterfully orchestrates events, using the willing and the wise to achieve his righteous purposes. It is a declaration that no situation is beyond his redemptive hand. He can quell the rage of a mighty warrior through the humble plea of a discerning woman, and he can execute perfect justice without human help. Her life, elevated from suffering to honor, reminds us that our faithful, courageous actions in the present unlock a future of unforeseen blessing. God is a God who not only saves us from our enemies, but often, more profoundly, saves us from ourselves, preserving our character and our destiny for His ultimate glory. If this message of wisdom, courage, and divine restoration has touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the profound workings of God in our lives.